In the year 1745, in the quiet fringes of colonial America, a boy was born whose name would echo in hushed tones long after his brief life had ended. Jonas Creighton entered the world in a small settlement on the outskirts of Massachusetts Bay, where Puritan traditions still held sway, where communities bound themselves tightly to their faith and their neighbors, and where children were raised under the harsh expectations of survival and obedience. His arrival was unremarkable. There were no omens or signs to mark him as unusual, and yet within the span of a few short years, it would become clear that Jonas was unlike other children. The Creighton family was neither rich nor poor. They lived in a modest farmhouse, sustained by labor on the land and the rhythms of the seasons. His father was a stern but practical man, hardened by years of toil. His mother, by contrast, was known in the village for her softness, for her desire to shield her children from the world's cruelties. Jonas was their third child, and while his siblings adapted to the strictures of colonial life, Jonas developed in ways that unsettled those around him. Even as a toddler, he displayed a calmness that was not the peace of innocence, but the vacancy of detachment. Where other children cried when scolded or laughed when praised, Jonas remained blank, his eyes unblinking, his reactions delayed or absent altogether. By the age of 5, villagers began to whisper. They said the boy had a cruel streak, one that revealed itself in small but chilling ways. Animals were often the first victims of such instincts, and Jonas was no exception. The Creighton household kept chickens, goats, and a single cow, creatures that provided the family with sustenance. Jonas, when left unsupervised, was seen cornering the chickens, pulling at their wings until the fragile bones cracked, watching them struggle with a detached curiosity. When caught, he did not cry or flee. He simply stared at his father with a calmness that unnerved him. Discipline was swift in that household, but it never seemed to affect Jonas. Whippings that left welts on his back brought no tears, only silence. His mother prayed for him, believing perhaps that he was possessed. But his father grew increasingly wary, seeing in his son not the marks of sin but of danger. In the village schoolhouse, Jonas was no better received. His intellect was sharp. He learned letters and sums with ease, memorized scripture with a precision that impressed his schoolmaster. But where his classmates laughed, played, and formed bonds, Jonas remained apart. He sat in silence, observing, always observing. When another child stumbled in recitation, Jonas's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, not of kindness, but of satisfaction. On one occasion, when a younger boy cut his hand with a quill, Jonas watched the blood bead and trickle down with an intensity that made the teacher step between them. There was no malice, not in the way most would understand it, but a fascination with harm, with the fragility of life that seemed entirely devoid of empathy. Stories began to circulate among the children. They whispered that Jonas played strange games when alone. Some claimed to have seen him arranging insects in rows, crushing one and leaving another alive, as though testing outcomes. Others swore they watched him place ants into tiny boxes of his own making, depriving them of air until they perished, only for Jonas to note how long it took. When confronted, he dismissed these accusations with calm denials, his face never betraying emotion. But the children avoided him, and even adults began to sense that there was something unnatural in the Creighton boy. As Jonas grew into adolescence, his cruelty deepened, no longer confined to animals or insects. Neighbors complained of tools gone missing, only to be found later broken, discarded in the woods. A small fire once erupted in the hayloft of a barn, and while no proof tied Jonas to the act, several swore they had seen him wandering nearby, his eyes fixed on the flames. When confronted, he showed no fear, no remorse, only that unnerving calmness, a calmness that made even grown men uneasy. His father's punishments escalated, but the boy endured them in silence. The lack of response was worse than rebellion, for it left the sense that Jonas was beyond correction. There was one incident, spoken of for years in the Creighton settlement, that cemented his reputation. A group of boys were playing by the river, roughhousing as boys do, when one of them, smaller than the rest, fell into the current. Panic ensued. The water was swift, and the boy struggled, crying for help. Most of the children screamed for adults or ran for assistance. Jonas, however, stood still on the riverbank, watching. Witnesses later said he stared with an intensity that chilled them, his lips barely parting as though he whispered something only he could hear. The boy drowned before help could arrive. When asked why he did not act, Jonas simply said, "It was his time." There was no shame, no sorrow in his voice, only the flat certainty of someone who believed himself beyond human concern. By the time he reached his mid-teens, Jonas had become a figure of quiet dread. His siblings avoided him, his parents despaired of him, and the villagers gave him wide berth. Yet for all their suspicions, no one dared act decisively. In those years, before the understanding of mental illness, there was no vocabulary for such behavior. The terms of the day were sin, evil, possession. Words that explained nothing but condemned everything. The Creightons prayed harder, hoping their son might be saved. But as the winds of war began to stir across the colonies, it would soon become clear that Jonas had no interest in salvation. He had his own path to follow, one that would lead him into the chaos of battlefields and etch his name forever into the dark margins of American history. The year 1754 brought with it the growing conflict that would become known as the French and Indian War, a struggle between empires that turned the colonies into battlegrounds. Men and boys alike were drawn into militias, pressed into service by necessity. Jonas, now nearing manhood, seized upon the opportunity with a zeal that surprised those who had long viewed him with unease. War, after all, was a place where cruelty could masquerade as courage, where violence was sanctioned, where the taking of life was not only permitted, but expected. For Jonas, it was not duty that called him, but opportunity. When he joined a provincial militia unit, those who served alongside him quickly noted the same qualities that had disturbed his village. He obeyed orders, but with an unsettling precision, never questioning, never hesitating. Where others struggled with the horrors of combat, the screams of the wounded, the blood in the mud, the stench of death, Jonas seemed unbothered. He carried out tasks with the same calm detachment he had shown since childhood, whether it was cleaning his musket, marching through the wilderness, or watching men fall at his side. To his commanders, he appeared disciplined, reliable, unshaken by fear. To his peers, he was something else entirely. A boy who looked upon battle as though it were a game. It was in those early skirmishes, when raids between militias and native allies turned brutal, that Jonas began to reveal what would earn him his grim epithet. Captured prisoners were sometimes brought back for questioning, and it was here that Jonas showed a chilling initiative. While older soldiers hesitated, unsure how far to go, Jonas stepped forward. He devised methods of interrogation that shocked even hardened men, speaking calmly as he inflicted pain, adjusting his approach as though experimenting. He seemed less interested in extracting information than in testing limits, in seeing how long a man could endure before breaking. When confronted about his methods, Jonas only shrugged, saying he was serving his unit, serving his cause. But the truth was written in his eyes. He was serving himself, indulging the fascination that had gripped him since childhood. By the time word of his actions spread, whispers had already given him a name, the boy who played God. It was not a compliment, but a condemnation, born of the fear that Jonas Creighton had begun to see himself not as a soldier, not as a man among men, but as something greater, a figure who decided life and death with the same detachment he once showed to chickens and insects. In the chaos of the French and Indian War, where records blurred and accountability was scarce, such a figure could thrive, hidden in plain sight, his crimes dismissed as the excesses of youth or the necessities of conflict. But for those who served beside him, there was no mistaking it. Jonas was not like them. He was something else entirely. Jonas Creighton's reputation grew quickly within the ranks of the provincial militia. What began as murmurs among soldiers hardened into unease, and unease soon evolved into fear. His composure under fire was unlike anything they had ever seen. When muskets cracked and cannon smoke filled the air, most men fought with trembling hands and desperate prayers. Jonas, still barely a man, remained unnervingly still, steady as though battle was not chaos but order, a stage where he could enact his will. This calmness made him effective. He was trusted to stand guard, to carry messages, to hold the line when others faltered. But alongside his usefulness, there was something deeply unsettling in the way he embraced violence. The French and Indian War was not fought like the old European conflicts. It was a war of ambushes and raids, of sudden attacks in the forests, of villages burned and civilians caught in the crossfire. For men raised in the farms and towns of the colonies, such brutality was often shocking. Yet Jonas thrived in it. He seemed to take to the wilderness as if it belonged to him, moving silently, eyes sharp, always volunteering for scouting missions where he might come across stragglers, where he might be alone with those who fell into his hands. Stories began to circulate of French soldiers who never made it back from patrols, of native allies who went missing after disagreements, of prisoners returned battered in ways that suggested more than interrogation. Those who fought beside Jonas noticed the way he looked at others. It was not the wary glance of a comrade watching for danger, nor the glance of a friend. It was appraising, clinical, as if he measured every man not as a person, but as a subject in some private experiment. In campfires after long marches, while others told stories or sang to distract themselves from fear, Jonas remained silent, staring into the flames with that same vacant detachment that had marked him since childhood. When asked what he thought about, he simply said, "I wonder how much one man can endure before he breaks." The soldiers laughed nervously, but the unease never left them. The turning point came during a raid on a French-aligned settlement. Jonas's unit stormed through the village, muskets firing, flames consuming wooden structures. In the aftermath, survivors were rounded up, women, children, and the elderly, too frail or too slow to escape. Most militia units would hand such captives over to officers or native allies. But Jonas asked to remain behind, offering to keep watch. His commander, weary and distracted, granted the request. When the unit returned the following day, they found the captives dead, their bodies arranged in a circle, faces marked with expressions of terror. Jonas stood calmly beside them, his musket cleaned, his uniform immaculate. When questioned, he shrugged, saying, "They had no use to us." There was no evidence to prove he alone had done it, but no one doubted. The circle of bodies looked less like an act of war and more like a ritual, a message left by a boy who saw himself above the rules that bound other men. It was this incident that cemented his epithet among the militia. They began to call him the boy who played God. The name spread not just among his comrades, but across companies and regiments, carried by rumor and fear. Some claimed he believed himself chosen, others that he was cursed. Whatever the explanation, men began to avoid him. He found himself isolated even among soldiers, an outsider within a brotherhood that valued trust and loyalty. Yet for Jonas, this isolation seemed not to trouble him. If anything, it emboldened him. He spoke little, but when he did, it was often chilling. Men think God decides when they die. They are wrong. Sometimes I do. In the broader context of the war, his actions were easy to lose in the tide of bloodshed. The French and Indian War was a brutal conflict, remembered for its scorched earth tactics, its massacres, its betrayals. To many in authority, Jonas was just another soldier hardened by war, his cruelty a product of necessity. Records of atrocities often blurred, and accountability was rare. But to those who served with him, there was no mistaking the difference. Most men committed violence reluctantly, driven by fear, by duty, by survival. Jonas committed it with fascination, as though testing the boundaries of human existence itself. One account, preserved in the journal of a militia sergeant, describes an ambush in the dense woods of Pennsylvania. Jonas and a small group captured 2 French scouts. The sergeant wrote that Jonas insisted on questioning them alone. Hours later, when the others returned, they found the prisoners alive but broken, their minds shattered, begging for death. Jonas calmly reported that they had told him nothing useful. When asked why he had gone so far, he replied, "I wanted to see how long a man clings to hope when all hope is gone." The sergeant noted that while the others recoiled in disgust, Jonas seemed genuinely curious, as if he had conducted a scientific experiment. Such incidents began to attract the attention of higher officers, though rarely in ways that led to discipline. In a war where brutality was common, Jonas's behavior was often excused as zeal. Yet whispers grew louder, and some officers expressed concern that he could not be controlled. There were fears he might one day turn his methods on his own comrades, that his detachment from morality left no guarantee of loyalty. Still, war makes use of monsters when it must, and Jonas was too effective to discard. He was sent on more dangerous missions, tasked with duties others shrank from. Each time he returned unscathed, calm, and increasingly feared. By the age of 17, Jonas had seen more death than most men twice his age. He had participated in raids, ambushes, and sieges. He had killed with musket, knife, and fire. But unlike others who carried the scars of such experiences, Jonas bore no visible weight. He slept soundly, ate heartily, and carried on as if untouched. For some, this resilience was enviable. For others, it was terrifying. They wondered what kind of boy could walk through hell and emerge without the smell of smoke clinging to him, without nightmares, without remorse. The answer, though few dared to say it aloud, was that Jonas Creighton was not like other men at all. As the war dragged on, his crimes escalated. He began to devise crueler methods of asserting control, targeting not only enemies, but occasionally those within his own ranks. A corporal once spoke out against him after a skirmish, accusing him of needlessly tormenting a prisoner. Days later, the corporal was found dead, his body mangled in a way that suggested no ordinary fight. Officially, it was blamed on the French. Unofficially, men whispered Jonas's name. When confronted by suspicion, he remained calm, even offering condolences. But the way he watched the others as they buried the corporal, silent, steady, unblinking, only deepened their fears. The image of Jonas as the boy who played God was reinforced not only by his actions but by the aura he carried. In moments of decision, he displayed a certainty that unnerved others. While most soldiers prayed before battles, Jonas simply stood still, eyes fixed forward, as if he already knew the outcome. When comrades asked if he feared death, he replied, "Why would I fear what I can choose?" To many, these words sounded like arrogance, even blasphemy. Yet there was conviction in his tone. The conviction of one who believed himself outside the bounds of ordinary humanity. By 1758, the war reached new levels of intensity, and Jonas's name was already circulating beyond his own unit. Captured French prisoners spoke of him with dread, describing a boy soldier who took pleasure in deciding who lived and who died. Native allies of the French told tales of an American youth who walked the forests like a spirit of death, leaving behind mutilated bodies as warnings. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they added to the legend. Jonas was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a figure of terror, whispered about even by enemies who had never seen his face. For Jonas himself, the growing infamy seemed only to fuel his sense of power. He began to act not as a subordinate, but as an arbiter, taking matters into his own hands without waiting for orders. When villages were captured, he decided which captives lived and which perished. When food supplies ran low, he determined who among the prisoners would be denied rations. He spoke little, but his actions carried the weight of judgment, as if he alone possessed the authority to decide the fates of others. To those who witnessed it, it was as though Jonas truly believed he played the role of God on earth, meting out life and death at will. And yet, for all his confidence, there were cracks in the facade. A chaplain by the war's midpoint, Jonas Creighton was no longer just another soldier. He was a legend, feared by enemies and mistrusted by allies, a boy whose crimes blurred the line between sanctioned violence and unholy cruelty. At an age when most young men still clung to the innocence of youth, Jonas had already become America's youngest war criminal, a figure whose deeds would be remembered long after the details of battles were forgotten. But his story was far from over. The war had more horrors in store, and Jonas had more darkness yet to unleash. By the winter of 1759, Jonas Creighton had become a name that echoed in fear across the wilderness. The French spoke of him as though he were a demon born of the forests, a pale apparition in colonial garb who decided the fate of men with a glance. Among the British and colonial ranks, his reputation was darker still. To some, he was a necessary weapon, a soldier so unflinching in the face of horror that he could do what others dared not. To others, he was a curse upon their cause, a boy whose appetite for cruelty tainted every victory. Either way, his presence had become impossible to ignore. The war had turned brutal. Villages were burned with increasing regularity, crops destroyed, and captives executed not out of strategy, but as a message. Yet even in this atmosphere of sanctioned violence, Jonas's actions stood apart. During a raid on a French outpost near Lake George, witnesses recalled how Jonas entered the blockhouse after the French surrendered. Rather than securing prisoners, he ordered the doors barred and set the building aflame. The screams that rose from within haunted even the most hardened veterans. When questioned afterward, Jonas responded coldly, "Prisoners consume rations. Fire consumes nothing but what it is given." To his mind, this was not cruelty but efficiency. Yet to all who heard his words, it was something far more chilling. The voice of a boy who viewed human life as nothing more than numbers to be balanced. His peers began to fear not only what he might do to the enemy, but also what he might do to them. There were reports of soldiers vanishing after disagreements with Jonas, their bodies discovered days later in the wilderness, marked by wounds too deliberate to be explained as combat. One young militiaman, Samuel Brigg, confided to his journal that Jonas had cornered him after an argument over rations. According to the entry, Jonas told him in a whisper, "Your heartbeat is a gift I can take back whenever I please." Samuel survived the war, but carried the memory of that moment like a scar, certain that his survival was not due to chance, but because Jonas allowed it. The unsettling truth was that Jonas seemed to understand fear better than any commander or chaplain. He wielded it like a weapon sharper than any bayonet. Captives broke more quickly in his presence. Soldiers obeyed without hesitation, not out of respect but out of dread. Even officers who outranked him hesitated before crossing him, as if uncertain whether discipline would provoke something worse. Jonas had become not merely a participant in the war, but a force within it, bending those around him to his will. But while Jonas grew more audacious, there were those who began to document his crimes in secret. A chaplain named Elias Morton, horrified by the boy's words and actions, kept careful records of each atrocity he heard whispered in camp. He wrote of the burned blockhouse, of mutilated captives, of soldiers who feared Jonas more than the enemy. In his writings, Morton described Jonas as a boy who believes himself ordained, yet not by heaven. He walks with the certainty of judgment, but his judgment is his own. These records would later serve as some of the only written accounts of Jonas Creighton's deeds, for official military logs remained silent, unwilling to stain the reputation of their cause with stories of a war criminal in their ranks. As the war reached its climax, Jonas's behavior grew stranger still. He began to speak less of tactics and more of fate, less of survival and more of power. To one officer he confided, "Men pray to God because they are weak. But in the woods, far from their churches, they look to me. I decide if they live to see the sunrise. Is that not the true power of God?" Such words spread quickly among the soldiers, deepening the aura of dread that surrounded him. Some whispered he had made a pact with dark forces, that his immunity to fear and death could not be natural. Others believed he had simply gone mad, his mind broken by years of killing. But those who had watched him closely knew better. Madness would have made him reckless. Jonas was never reckless. His actions were precise, deliberate, chosen. The Battle of Quebec in 1759 marked one of the defining moments of the war, and Jonas was there. Amid the chaos on the plains of Abraham, he was seen moving calmly through the smoke, musket in hand, face unflinching as cannon fire ripped men apart around him. One surviving soldier recalled seeing Jonas stop beside a wounded French officer, crouch down, and watch him gasp for air. Rather than deliver a swift death, Jonas pressed his hand against the man's throat. Not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to prolong the struggle. The soldier claimed Jonas whispered something to the officer in French before finally standing and walking away, leaving the man to die slowly. When asked later what he had said, Jonas only smiled faintly. "I told him that God was watching, and so was I." It was after Quebec that Jonas's downfall began to take shape. His growing defiance of authority, his increasing boldness in choosing life and death without orders, could no longer be ignored. Some officers demanded he be removed from service, though others argued that his reputation alone inspired terror in the enemy. But whispers turned into petitions, and petitions into action. By 1760, Jonas found himself under quiet investigation, though such inquiries were hindered by the lack of official evidence. Few dared to speak openly against him, and those who did often found their courage fading under his gaze. Still, cracks began to show in his control. A group of captured French soldiers managed to escape one night, and when recaptured, they spoke of the horrors Jonas had inflicted upon them. Their bodies bore wounds too deliberate to be mistaken for battle. When word spread, even those who had once tolerated Jonas began to waver. Officers could dismiss rumors, but they could not dismiss scars. The chaplain Elias Morton confronted him openly at last, demanding that Jonas repent or face judgment. Witnesses described the confrontation as tense, with Morton invoking the wrath of heaven and Jonas replying only, "If heaven disapproves, why does it not strike me down?" This arrogance, this challenge hurled against the very concept of divine justice, was the final straw for many. Yet even then Jonas remained untouchable, for his skill and fearsome reputation still served a purpose. The war was not yet finished, and those in power weighed morality against necessity. Jonas remained in the field, though watched more closely than before. It was during the final campaigns of the war that Jonas committed his most infamous act, the one that would forever brand him not just as a monster but as a figure of legend. In a captured French settlement near Montreal, dozens of civilians were gathered by British forces. While officers debated their fate, Jonas acted. Without orders, he separated the captives into groups, the old, the young, the able-bodied. Witnesses said he walked among them with a terrifying calm, pointing to one after another, sparing some, condemning others. Those condemned were executed on the spot. When an officer demanded to know by what authority he acted, Jonas answered, "By the same authority your God claims, the authority to decide who matters and who does not." This act of cold judgment horrified even those hardened by years of war. It was not strategy, it was not necessity. It was theater, a deliberate demonstration of power. The officers present finally had no choice but to restrain him. He was removed from the field, though not formally charged. To charge him would have meant admitting that such horrors had been allowed within their ranks. Instead, Jonas was quietly dismissed, his name omitted from official records, his deeds left to rot in rumor and whispered accounts. But legends cannot be buried so easily. Soldiers who had served with him carried their stories home, telling of the boy who played God, of the war criminal too young to shave yet old enough to decide the fate of men. Some painted him as a demon, others as a warning of what war could make of a boy. Parents whispered his name to frighten children into obedience. For decades, his reputation lingered like smoke after a fire. And yet those who study the war, those who pore over the letters and journals of men long dead, know that Jonas was no mere ghost story. The chaplain Elias Morton's journals survived, preserved in fragments, bearing witness to atrocities that could not have been imagined. Other soldiers' writings, scattered across archives, contain references to him, vague yet unmistakable. The truth lies in these scraps, in the fearful words of men who faced not only an enemy across the battlefield, but a monster within their own ranks. For history often sanitizes itself, smoothing out the rough edges, excusing horrors as necessity. But in the story of Jonas Creighton, there is no excuse, no comfort. There is only the chilling reality of a boy who believed himself divine, who wielded life and death as tools, who saw in the suffering of others not tragedy, but proof of his own power. By the war's end, America had changed, the colonies forever altered by bloodshed and alliances. Yet within that story of nations and armies lies the darker story of Jonas Creighton, a boy whose crimes remind us that war is not fought only with muskets and cannons, but with the choices men make when they believe themselves untouchable. The French and Indian War ended in 1763, with Britain claiming victory and vast new territories in North America. For most soldiers, the end of war meant a return to farms, families, and the fragile hope of peace. But for those who had marched beside Jonas Creighton, peace was a difficult concept. His memory clung to them like a shadow, an echo that could not be silenced even when muskets were stacked and uniforms discarded. They returned home, but when they closed their eyes at night, they saw his face in the firelight, heard his calm words as he passed judgment on men, women, and children alike. For years, stories of Jonas spread quietly across the colonies. In taverns where veterans gathered, his name slipped out in whispers, always spoken with a mix of fear and disbelief. Some told of how he burned prisoners alive. Others spoke of his methodical experiments on captives. A few claimed he had turned against his own comrades, delivering death as casually as one might swat a fly. With every retelling, the boy who played God became less a soldier and more a figure of terror. Something almost supernatural in the way he lingered in the imagination. Parents warned unruly children that Jonas Creighton would come for them if they disobeyed. Preachers invoked him in sermons as proof of the devil's reach into the hearts of men. Yet alongside the legend were fragments of truth, fragile pieces preserved in journals, letters, and testimonies. Chaplain Elias Morton's writings, hidden for decades, were among the clearest accounts. In them, he described Jonas as a boy, with the coldness of death in his eyes, as though the soul had been stripped from him and replaced with judgment. Morton believed Jonas was not simply a product of war, but something darker, a figure who delighted in wielding power over life and death. To Morton, Jonas was a warning that evil did not always wear the face of a tyrant or king. Sometimes it wore the face of a boy too young to understand the weight of his crimes. Historians who study the war often wrestle with how to interpret Jonas Creighton. On one hand, the French and Indian War was brutal on all sides, with massacres and atrocities committed by both armies and their allies. On the other, Jonas's actions stood apart, not because they were worse, but because they were deliberate, chosen not out of desperation, but out of desire. Most men killed because they had to. Jonas killed because he wanted to. That distinction, however subtle, is what branded him a war criminal in the eyes of those who survived him. But what became of Jonas after the war? That question has no clear answer, and perhaps that is why his legend endured. Some accounts suggest he drifted westward, vanishing into the frontier where the wilderness could swallow men whole. There were scattered reports of massacres in remote settlements, killings so cruel and calculated that survivors swore Jonas must have been responsible. But without proof, these claims remained little more than rumors. Others believed he was executed in secret by British officers who wanted to erase the stain of his crimes. A few claimed he lived quietly under a false name, blending into the colonies like any other man, carrying his darkness with him in silence. The lack of certainty turned Jonas into a kind of ghost. He was not buried in a marked grave. He left behind no family, no estate, no trace in census rolls or land deeds. He was a boy who seemed to vanish into the folds of history, existing only in the stories men could not stop telling. And perhaps that was fitting. A figure who believed himself God would not pass away like an ordinary man. He would linger as an idea, as a warning, as a name spoken in fear long after his body was gone. By the time of the American Revolution, a generation later, the story of Jonas Creighton was still alive. Some veterans of the earlier war passed it down to their sons, warning them of the dangers of unchecked cruelty. Patriots and loyalists alike repeated the tale of the boy who played God. Proof that tyranny could rise not only in kings, but in ordinary men. In this way, Jonas became something larger than himself. He became a symbol of the darkness that lives within the human heart, of the thin line between order and chaos, of what happens when a boy is given the power of life and death before he understands what it means to live. Even today, historians debate Jonas's story. Was he truly as monstrous as the accounts suggest, or did the horrors of war exaggerate his reputation? Could a boy of 16 or 17 truly have committed such atrocities? Or did his youth make him a convenient scapegoat for crimes others wished to forget? These questions may never be answered. But whether Jonas was a singular monster or the embodiment of war's cruelty, the stories remain. They remind us that history is not only about nations and treaties, but about the individuals who shape it, for good or for ill. And in Jonas Creighton's case, it is a reminder of how thin the line can be between man and monster. His childhood cruelty, his fascination with power, his calm detachment from suffering, all of these traits converged in the crucible of war, creating something that neither side could explain nor control. He became America's youngest war criminal, a figure who stood apart from both friend and foe, a boy who played God in a world already drowning in blood. When we look back on the French and Indian War, we see a struggle for empire, for land, for the future of nations. But hidden within those battles is the story of Jonas Creighton, a story that unsettles us because it does not fit neatly into the grand narratives of history. It is not a tale of heroism or patriotism, but of cruelty and arrogance, of a boy who saw in war not duty but opportunity, the opportunity to decide who would live and who would die, and perhaps that is why his legend has endured. For deep down, we fear not only the enemy across the battlefield, but the darkness within our own ranks, the darkness within ourselves. Jonas Creighton forces us to confront that fear, to ask whether we too could fall into the same temptation if given the same power. Could any of us, handed the authority of life and death, resist the urge to play God? The story of Jonas Creighton is not simply a tale of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present, a reminder that cruelty is not confined to any era. The boy who played God may have lived in the 18th century, but his shadow stretches across time, warning us of what happens when we forget that power without conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. And so, Jonas remains, not in monuments, not in official records, but in the fearful whispers of history. A boy whose crimes defied explanation, whose arrogance mocked both man and God, whose name lingers like smoke in the ruins of war. Jonas Creighton, America's youngest war criminal, the boy who played God. If you've stayed with me through this chilling journey into forgotten history, I invite you to reflect on what you've heard. Do you believe Jonas was a monster born, or a monster made by the fires of war? Was he truly a singular evil, or simply a reflection of the cruelty that lies in all of us? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this story as haunting as I did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more dark tales from the shadows of history, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these forgotten stories alive.